Welcome back to Africa Science Focus, the weekly science and development show from SciDevNet. I'm Ogechi Kianyawo. This week, we're exploring the potential of African science. That was the focus of the Science Forum that took place on December 4th, 2023 at the Future Africa campus in University of Pretoria, South Africa. At the forum, scientists and policymakers from across the continent gathered to talk about advancing the societal impact of science and boosting African science, technology, and innovation through collaborations. The event held in collaboration with the International Science Council in South Africa, and among the scientists present was Dr. Dorothy Ngila, Director of Strategic Partnerships at the National Research Foundation in South Africa. She emphasized the importance of collaboration and strategic partnerships in elevating African science globally.
Strategic partnerships are critical in supporting the continent in a variety of ways. We know that collaboration is an important component of how researchers have to work. We know that for us to be able to manage and support the transboundary challenges and innovative solutions that are required, strategic partnerships are a part of that. So I see strategic partnerships as really critical and core to the work of advancing research and science on the continent.
Strategic partnerships are already showing promising results. Africa's share of global academic publication output has more than doubled from 1.5% in 2005 to 3.2% in 2016. The citation impact of African authored papers has also been on the rise over the past 3 decades, the forum heard. However, there's still room to grow, and the conference also aimed to explore the next steps for collaborative action. One action proposed by scientists and policymakers at the event is the establishment of an African Science Leaders Forum, an alliance aimed at connecting science system leaders across various sectors. Our reporter, Michael Kaloki, spoke with Dr. Farai Kapfudzaruwa, Research and Strategic Partnerships Manager at the University of Pretoria's Future Africa platform. He shared insights into the implementation of the African Charter for Transformative Research Collaborations.
Future Africa is the University of Pretoria's transformative research platform, which is designed to enable collaborative research across the institution, but also across the continent, to ensure that we address some of the societal challenges that the continent as well as the world is facing. Relating to the Africa Charter on Transformative Research Partnerships, this was an initiative which was launched by Bristol University in partnership with the University of Cape Town and UNISA in South Africa. But it is over 300 signatories from across the continent, including research institutions, but also policy institutions working in the science ecosystem. And it's primarily designed to address the challenges which a lot of African researchers are facing with regards to the partnerships that they have with the Global North partners, because that's where predominantly our research funding is coming from. So that relationship has often created issues related to equity and asymmetries in the way the agendas of those researchers set, the division of labor, issues of dissemination of research output. So the research charter intends to rebalance the research ecosystem across the globe, particularly as it pertains to the Global North and Global South research partnerships, to enable African researchers to research the agenda on issues which are of priority to the continent, but also to reevaluate and reframe how we do research in terms of the epistemological issues to do with language, so that we prioritize African languages and African epistemologies and theories of development which are of importance to Africa. This also speaks to the issues of resourcing to the continent. So this charter is designed to enable African researchers to have a say and have an impact in how research is done on the continent.
So next I'll be speaking to Dr. Vanessa McBride. Dr. McBride is the Science Director at the International Science Council, and Dr. McBride is speaking to me from Paris in France. Dr. McBride, Are there existing intercontinental scientific collaborations that you are aware of? And what impact, if any, have these collaborations had on scientific developments on the continent?
Yes, I think there are some clear examples of ways in which African scientists have contributed. I think sort of coming back to my own area of expertise, which is my background is in astronomy, there's been clear opportunities for scientists to contribute to shaping one of the biggest astronomy experiments that we've ever performed, and that's through the Square Kilometre Array project. And a lot of that work has happened through collaborations. So this is a big international project that at the moment is led through a intergovernmental organization. And the project is, the physical infrastructure is based across Africa and also across Australia. And through this kind of organization and through these kinds of collaborations, African scientists have had a voice in not only the infrastructure, but also in things like the data management, and they will have a voice also in terms of the science products and the results when that comes online. So that's one example. To some extent, the Square Kilometre Array collaboration is one that is just starting out and has the potential to have these kinds of impacts. Maybe one that is better known is the synchrotron light source experiment, often known by its abbreviation SESAME. So that is a physics experiment that is a intercontinental between Africa and the Middle East experiment, and has really raised the visibility of physics on the continent, and has also opened doors for African and Middle Eastern students and researchers to participate in more global fora and in more global experiments in terms of physics. So this has really grown this community and the capacity for it on the African continent. I think there's probably many examples. Another one, just to list something in a different field, is the H3 Africa collaboration. So this is a collaboration that's more in the medical side. It's around humanity, hereditary and health. And it's really looking at creating a database around genomic data on the continent of Africa. You know, as we know, humanity came from Africa, yet there has been a real gap in genomic data from Africa and actually resident within Africa. And so this informs all sorts of things like, you know, how we respond to disease, how genetics are important, and many other factors on the continent. And so this project really looks to bring that data together, to keep it on the African continent, and also to create some tools around how best to deal with the huge quantities of data that are required for this line of research.
Dr. McBride, could you explain to me a little bit more about the first project you spoke about, that is the Array project? Could you give me a few more details about what it is about?
So the Square Kilometre Array project is really a project to try and understand some very fundamental things about the universe. So the idea is to use radio waves to look very far back into the history of the universe and to understand how the very first stars and planets might have formed. And in order to do this, you need incredibly sensitive scientific instruments. And the idea is to build an array of radio telescopes that has a collection area of 1 square kilometre. So that means that you have many different dishes that are capturing radio waves from the sky, and these are linked together as one telescope. And the idea is that these dishes will be distributed mainly within the Northern Cape in South Africa, but with sort of spiral structures of dishes throughout other countries in Africa. And the idea is also that the data from all these dishes will be combined and synthesized in fairly state-of-the-art computers. The amount of data generated is going to be incredibly huge, and so countries are interested in this not just because of the the interesting science that will come out of it, but actually because having to build these types of instruments means that we have to make huge progress in the way that we store data, analyze data in real time, and it also pushes our understanding of reproducibility of scientific results. So these are all areas where we're really going to expect new technologies to come out of what is framed as a scientific question.
And just a last question in regards to that particular project. As an astronomer, what impact specifically do you feel that project, the Array project, will have in boosting scientific development on the continent?
Yes, so thanks for that, Michael. I think there's two main impacts that I see. I think one of them is the project itself, at least in South Africa and beyond, has already had quite an impact in the number of master's and PhD students that have studied astronomy. And many of them don't stay in the field of astronomy, which is also fine because, these kinds of skills are highly transferable. And so whether you end up working for a financial analysis firm or whether you end up staying as an academic in the field, it's the same kind of analytic and problem-solving skills that can be applied across multiple sectors of society. So I think that's one of the key things. I think another of the key things is that we've already seen in the astronomy community how this project has pulled the community together in terms of organizing itself. And that really links back to some of your earlier questions, because in the last 5 or so years, we've seen a huge revitalization in the African Astronomical Society. So that is now an incredibly active society that has an annual meeting every year, that has a high level of qualified membership, and the community, you can see, is working together to address issues that are broader than just astronomy, even issues now relating to publications for the community on the continent. And that community now has created a voice that is able to engage with their counterparts, the European Astronomical Society, the American Astronomical Society, in order to create initiatives that can lead to both research and human capacity development results. So I think we're starting to see, the kind of impact that these projects can potentially have in growing voices for our scientific communities.
As Dr. Vanessa McBride highlighted, some of these international collaborations are generating vast amounts of new data. The African Open Science Platform, established in 2017, aims to position African scientists at the forefront of data-intensive science. This initiative, including Future Africa, fosters interactivity, shared capacities, and also amplifies impact. Dr. Farai Kapfudzaruwa.
Over the past few years, there's been an increased number of these Pan-African open science platforms, some of them linked to international organizations. So, for example, Future Africa, we are part of the African Open Science Platform. We are also part of the Future Earth Africa Science Leadership Hub, just to mention a few. And I think one of the key important roles that these open platforms is ensuring is that it's creating a platform which allows for transdisciplinarity, where different stakeholders, different disciplines are able to converge, and that allows for the transition of research so that it's impactful. So that's the first important point of that. These platforms have an important role in ensuring an impact in addressing societal challenges. But also these platforms have enables the leveraging of competencies and different resources that different institutions across the continent have. At the moment, there are a lot of institutions which are doing different work. Sometimes it's duplication. So having a platform such as the Future Earth Africa Leadership Hub, it allows them to different institutions to share those kind of resources and avoid duplications. But also, you recognize that the way a lot of science is being done on the continent is very siloed, in the sense that it's very discipline-oriented, it's not multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary. So having a platform which brings together multiple stakeholders and disciplines, it allows you to address issues in a very systemic and also address very complex challenges, because many of the societal challenges that the continent is facing are very complex and they require a very transdisciplinary approach to doing that. And these science platforms create an opportunity to address those issues. There are other issues which these platforms are enabling. For example, the issue of data management. The issue of data is a big challenge when it comes to doing science in Africa. So these platforms allow for more or less, like, for example, the African Open Science platform, it allows for a very federated system which allows scientists and different stakeholders to share and manage data in a very much coordinated way, which enables us to create impact to society. And also, lastly, I think these open science platforms, they are creating networks and building connections which would not be possible if institutions were working individually or in a very siloed approach.
Dr. Farai, if I could just add a question to that as well, then would it then be correct to say that these platforms then advance collaboration between scientists?
Certainly, because the whole ethos of doing science is to firstly to address societal challenges. And as I mentioned, the complexity in which we're facing these challenges requires scientists to collaborate with other scientists, not only across disciplines but across different countries. Because, for example, Africa is not a very homogeneous geographical space. It's very complex. There are very multiple differences in terms of culture, languages. So these platforms allow this kind of collaborations to take place in a multifaceted manners across disciplines, across regions, across languages, across cultures. So that's the value of these collaborations, just on a continental level, without even speaking these global North-South partnerships, which in some instances bring resources.
Thank you, Dr. Farai. Now, Dr. Ngila, you have explored the role of science advice as an enabler in the interface between science and policy. Based on this, whose primary role do you feel it is to accelerate the development of the continent's science systems? Is it the scientists or is it the continent's governments?
So before I can answer that, I wanted to add something about the African Open Science Platform, just what Farai was talking about in relation to the types of networks that the AOSP is bringing together. For me, I also find that one of its biggest value is that it is bringing together different communities. So the policymakers, the public funders, the researchers, the research networks, partners who are from the global south, partners who are from the global north, and to actually have a very honest conversation about what do we mean by open science on the continent, how do we enable open science on the continent, and how is it going to be supported so that we can ensure that the path is sustainable. Coming back to the question of science advice, so science advice is one of those aspects about the science ecosystem that has become more and more critical, especially in two ways. Science advice for policymakers so that they are able to make the best decisions on how and where and who to fund, but also science advice in being able to bring forth the new findings, the research conclusions and recommendations to the table for policymakers and decision makers, actually to be able to consider those in the different paths that we are creating. I had the greatest privilege for 7 years of my life to really focus on this question of science advice with a specific interest in how academies of science really provide platform for policymakers to be able to engage with scientists and the other way around. I think that there is space for both. There is space for science advisors, and in this space, whether it is organizations such as academies of science or individual researchers in the form of chief scientists or networks of researchers that come together to really provide information, valuable information and evidence that then supports policy making. And there is a specific set of skills that scientists need to be able to have. There is also, it's important for them to think about the independence and objectivity of science as they approach the policymakers, but then be able to walk the journey with policymakers. Then there is a lot of value in governments that find that it is important for them to seek evidence to support the way that they make decisions, whether they are making decisions around science policy or they are making decisions about very specific outcomes that they would like to see, whether it's in health, it's in water and sanitation, it's in science and technology itself, it's innovation. And I think the ideal is to be able to think about science advice as the suit that really sits in between the policymakers and decision makers and the researchers, and that really needs specific care so that we are able to ensure that the science is pulling through to the policymakers, but also that the policymakers find the science that they are getting useful and that they are able to access the researchers whenever it is needed. It is an area in our continent that needs a little bit more support, both from a decision maker perspective, but also needs a lot more support from a research perspective to ensure that these two worlds can come closer and closer and closer.
Dr. Ngila, you mentioned science academies there. Are these bodies that you think would be able to boost, or do they boost collaboration between scientists? And then just to add on to the previous discussion there, are there examples on the continent where policy has had a significantly positive impact in strengthening the voice of African scientists?
So I think that academies of science are an institution that on the continent is highly underutilized and also undervalued in many ways, both from a policymaker perspective and also from a science system perspective. Academies of science are structured to be think tanks, if you can call it that way, but think tanks that are bringing together individual researchers in all their specific fields to be able, first of all, to congregate together and to be a space where science and scientists is spoken about, where they congregate and have conversations about how to advance science. But most importantly, in terms of science advice, being able to then bring that science in a well-packaged way, and I specifically focused on the consensus method of bringing recommendations to policymakers, being able to bring evidence to policymakers from a group, a body that is made up of the most eminent scientists of a specific country, and when they connect together as academies of science, then from bodies of the most top scientists of our continent in essence. South Africa has an Academy of Science, the Academy of Science of South Africa. Uganda has the Uganda National Academy of Sciences. We have a Pan-African Academy of Science, the African Academy of Science. And for me, what would be really key is to look at the African Academy of Science as a resource for the way that we are making decisions from a continental perspective. So the African Union Commission and how we are structuring the different paths that we need. It's also to be able to create a pathway for national academies of science to really offer that independent advisory support to the state and to other decision makers. It's very clear to me that the different networks of science are critical for us to be able to deal with different parts of what science needs. Academies of Science brings a network of scientists that are really focused on science advice. There are young academies of science. The network of universities, the ARUA and the African Alliance for Partnerships or Alliance for African Partnerships, and the other networks of universities also engender a specific type of support that is required to enhance collaboration. And I think bringing them all together, when we have conversations, for example, when we host the science forums or science conversations on the continent, allows us to be able to tap into the different constituencies. And there's certainly a growing need for us to hear what the different pockets of science, the different perspectives from science are, and we can look at it from a network perspective, or we can also look at it from a networking of the network's perspective. But we are certainly seeing a more unified voice of science on the continent, if not fully unified, at least unified about what the value of science is to the continent, and unified also in the different communities that we find ourselves as scientists on the continent.
The benefits of this collaboration, partnerships, and the platform are clear. They give African science a global voice. But is a unified voice necessary? We asked this question to Dr. McBride, Dr. Kapfudzaruwa, and Dr. Ngila.
I think it's crucial that African scientists have a voice, but I don't think it's crucial that they have a unified voice. You know, Africa is such a diverse place, and there's different priorities and, of course, so many different players. I think it's important to have multiple voices, but I think on some crucial topics, it's important that those voices work together, especially in an arena where there's a lot of competition. So I think it's useful for there to be many different voices, but on certain topics for those voices to work together for the greater good.
The importance, firstly, of having a very unified voice is that it enables us to uplift and share the value of African science to the global science system, but also the fact that a lot of the work that is being done on the African continent in terms of science and technology and innovation is somewhat very fragmented. So there is a need for a very unified voice which allows the African continent to be able to negotiate when it comes to setting agendas for a lot of these issues. You find that when it came to, for example, the COVID pandemic and the distribution of vaccines, Africa often was left behind because, one, we didn't have a voice on the global agenda and setting the priorities in terms of the pandemic. The COVID pandemic, there was a lot of excellent work which was done on genomics on the African continent, which has immense value to the world, but it was not very much recognized because of this fragmented nature in which in some of our science ecosystem in the continent is. So that's why it's very critical that there is a unified voice on the continent in terms of science. So as part of the work that we are doing here at Future Africa with the International Science Council, there's propositions to leverage on some of the work that is already being done on the continent to set up what we're calling a Science, Technology and Innovation Leadership Forum, which brings on board all these different stakeholders which are doing work to strengthen and unleash the value of the African science ecosystem.
I think science needs to have a unified voice in relation to the value of science to society and the value of good science to advance our society and our globe. I think that it is very important for science and scientists to continuously question each other, question themselves, and through that be able to experiment, be able to move ideas to the next level. So unified, yes, about the greater cause of science. Science is important, but within science itself, we have to continuously hold each other accountable for the quality, the excellence, and just the pursuit for scientific excellence.
That's all from us at Africa Science Focus today. If you want to find out more, head to the SciDevNet website. That's www.scidev.net. Today's show was produced by Martin Redfern, with editing by Ogechie Kianyawo and Titilope Fadare, and reporting by Michael Kaloki. I'm Ogechie Kianyawo, and until next time, it's goodbye. This podcast was supported by the Science Granting Council's initiative, which aims to strengthen the institutional capacities of 18 public science funding agencies in sub-Saharan Africa. African Science Focus is produced by SciDevNet and distributed in association with your local radio station.